And Jane is, as you will see from SRK, and has huge experience working across the world on a multitude of different operations as a whole. So without further ado, Jane, across to yourself. I think you might be on mute at the moment.
Sorry about that. The compliance obligations that I'm going to be talking about are approval and permit conditions, terms and conditions of agreements and commitments made by stakeholders. They're legally binding obligations. I'm not going to be talking about voluntary commitments made in corporate policies, for example. Oh, I'm struggling to advance my presentation here. Oh, there we are. These compliance obligations are usually site-specific, and they're usually made through legal processes such as environmental and social impact assessment processes and approval processes, other permitting processes, through negotiation of agreements, and they generally reach through extensive stakeholder engagement. Who are the parties who neglect compliance? They're listed here. Many, but not all, definitely not all. In my opinion, the main reason why compliance obligations are neglected is a genuine lack of awareness that the obligations are being created in those processes that I mentioned earlier. And also, over the last couple of decades, there hasn't been huge pressure to achieve compliance. Mines only get in trouble if they're in conflict with government or there's a big incident. I can think of a mine that I looked at fairly recently that has been operational for 20 years, and in the early stages of permitting that mine, they committed to line their tailings facilities, and that never happened, and nobody was ever really aware that the commitment existed until more recent times. Now, that loss of institutional memory that you see at mines arises because a lot of the people who are involved in permitting don't continue into the construction phase and into the operational phase. Also, mines may have selective or partial compliance. They will be focusing on some permits and not realizing that they have compliance obligations in a number of other documents. Environmental and social consultants like me even can neglect compliance. We know very well that these commitments are being created in processes, but sometimes when we review operations, we don't have the budget to look at compliance, and we can't do it properly unless a mine has a compliance obligation register. It takes quite a bit of time. There are so many compliance obligations, you can't comprehend those quickly. Regulatory authorities inspect mines frequently, but they often don't look at compliance properly. They will focus in on particular areas of interest, and in different jurisdictions they have got favorite subjects that they look at, and mines will report to regulatory authorities on compliance. They're supposed to. There'll be annual reporting, quarterly reporting, even monthly reporting. The mines in those reports, even though they're submitting to the regulatory authorities, are not specifically talking about their compliance obligations. In fact, they'll present monitoring data and they will present information of interest to the regulatory authorities, but not specifically cover compliance. In the last 2 decades, there's been an explosion of ESG standards that mines have to observe, particularly in recent years. And these can sometimes distract from compliance obligations. Many do require observation of legal requirements of compliance obligations, but they do distract. One example is GRI reporting. Sometimes there's such a focus on metrics and the reporting is very much at a corporate level, and site-specific issues are neglected. Also, the IFC performance standards, those are very well-known standards. I respect them very much, but the way they're implemented can be a problem. And I've seen this problem in Africa, I've seen this problem in Europe, I've seen this problem in countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. Basically, what happens is lenders require that an additional environmental impact assessment process is taken. That's in parallel or after a government environmental impact assessment process. And what happens sometimes is that process is conducted completely independently of the regulatory process. So agreements that have been negotiated, commitments that have been made, don't come into the management plans that are done for lenders. And so you'll have these mines, the whole set of management plans produced for lenders and different plans produced for regulatory authorities. I worked with a mine that had an incident a little while ago, and they had a great deal of difficulty explaining to the regulatory authorities that they were working to completely different plans, that they had completely different from the plans they had agreed with the regulatory authorities. This slide, it is quite a complicated slide, but it's showing the pressures on projects and operations. There's really only one point I want to make with this slide, but the purple is showing the legal side. There is international law gets transposed into national legislation, and then the legislation gets translated into compliance obligations through permitting processes. And that's the purple. The blue is showing corporate requirements that are imposed on projects, and the green requirements imposed by financial institutions. The main point I want to make on this slide is that these all have common origins. They are actually all influenced by international initiatives, and similar principles are being implemented through all these routes. This slide, I want to make the point that, and if I drew the scale, I would draw it even more unbalanced. I just borrowed an image that most of the compliance obligations that mines have are environmental and social governance obligations. Mines have a huge number of environmental and social governance obligations. This slide is illustrating specifically mining law. It's not illustrating other law. And it's actually illustrating mining codes in West Africa, which are quite modern. In many West African countries, they follow a similar model with their mining codes. So the mining codes require that environmental law is respected. You can't get mining approvals without environmental approvals being in place in the first place. They require respectful law on land tenure and human rights. They require respectful labor law, and they require respectful tax law. But they also have special requirements about addressing poverty, value creation, shared value, not destroying value. They require local employment, local procurement, providing training and contributing to research, contributing to community development, participating in extractive industry transparency initiatives, and planning and providing for closure. That might be interesting for people who don't work in Africa, realizing that the mining law has got many ESG requirements embedded in the law. This slide, I'm showing that compliance obligations that mines typically have, and as I go through it, I'll give you an idea of the number of obligations that you will typically find. So in a mining permit, you would typically find 10 to 20 environmental and social governance obligations. In a minerals agreement, a modern minerals agreement, you would also find about 20 requirements which link directly to the legislation. So these items that I showed you earlier, it will be more specific in the minerals agreement. So the minerals agreement might say 90% of your workforce must be local. So it will give a number for the requirement. In Europe, you don't have minerals agreements, you'll have planning agreements instead, and those will have many terms and conditions in them as well. Environmental authorizations generally have more than 30 requirements in, and then all the other environmental permits that have to be obtained will also have 10 to 30 requirements in them. In the green, the legally binding management plans that are submitted as part of the permitting processes often contain hundreds of commitments in them. And that's where people don't realize, those are the compliance obligations that sometimes get lost. People don't realize that those have become binding in the permitting processes. So they include mine waste management plans, biodiversity action plans, and closure plans. Then the commitments in resettlement plans, community development agreements, and the lenders' environmental and social action plans, which are produced at the end of a due diligence before financing a project. Those are generally very neat and usually only have 10 or 20 well-stated commitments. All the commitments I've talked about now are generally site-specific, unique to the project in its setting. Customer agreements are being introduced through supplier codes of conduct now, and they are more generic. Mines that are performing well in terms of tracking their compliance obligations don't look like this. They don't look like they're drowning in their compliance obligations. What they do have is they don't just have a register of the legislation that's applicable. They'll have a full register of permits and agreements. They'll have a register of all their compliance obligations in those permits and agreements. They'll be tracking compliance with that. They'll be auditing it, and they will be reviewing where they're not complying and taking action to achieve compliance. Now, mines who are doing that realize that they have to look very carefully at the compliance obligations they make in the first place, because many mines find when they first look at the compliance obligations, they realize that they're very poorly worded and very difficult to follow. So if they've got experience and they're paying attention to this, when they're permitting, they will make sure that the commitments are sensible in their permitting processes and in the negotiation of their agreements. Right, it's the end.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Jane. And you can hear in your imagination that applause that has now been given to you from behind all of those muted microphones. So thank you so much for that, and that insight into the compliance aspects of what a mining company, for example, needs to be doing. So on that, we've got a number of questions that have come in here, and one comes from Michael, and he says, "Hi Jane, do you consider mapping compliance reporting and regulations into a hierarchy?" And this, he gives some more context to say that this is something that he did at Sustainalytics concerning the various tailings management and reporting standards. So that's the mapping of the compliance reporting and the regulations.
I don't perfectly understand what you're saying, but yes, I would imagine you need to map compliance reporting and regulations, link the two together.
Brilliant. So I think this is maybe something here, Michael, if you want to exacerbate on what or build on your question, feel free to do that in the Q&A, and then Jane will be able to maybe take this offline and be able to answer you a bit better. So this is a case here, Jane, I think, where Michael's asking about a hierarchy of importance. So what are the most important requirements, say, for example, within the compliance aspects that need to be addressed first?
Yes, I think that's very wise, that there is a hierarchy of importance and understanding of materiality and importance.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jane. And another question here comes in from Teresa. And what she's asking, she's saying that your presentation clearly maps out the workload on the environment, social governance members of staff, or the departments on a mine site, who have to somehow also monitor and report on all of these compliance obligations, I suspect, as well as a load of other requirements that are coming in from different auditors, customers, etc. And what Teresa's saying is that there are, in her experience, very few mines who actually do this really well. And so the competence of the regulators, as well as the on-site practitioners, further impacts the ability of mines to do this well. So if you had to highlight one critical success factor to doing this well, what would you say it might be?
I think it's awareness and having sufficient budget. I absolutely agree with I think you said it was Teresa, I agree with everything she says there. I think it is awareness, and when minds are aware of how many compliance obligations they have, they realize that they have to allocate more time and budget to follow this properly. I think sometimes the resources aren't there to do the tracking track all these compliance obligations. I've seen mines with thousands of compliance obligations, not hundreds, thousands.
And that's something there where perhaps, Jane, yesterday we heard Joughin giving a fantastic overview with regards to governance, and something that Joughin said during that talk. And Joughin, I know that you are here and listening, so please feel free to challenge me on my interpretation of what you said. Joughin was talking about the culture that governance helps to create, and how perhaps that is sometimes one of the differentiators between governance and compliance. Would you agree with that? Or would you say actually often you may find a culture that is associated with the level or the importance that different companies put on compliance?
I don't think compliance and governance are different things. I think compliance is a fundamental part of a management system. Understanding all your obligations, all your commitments you've made to all the different parties is absolutely central to governance. And I can't see them separated at all. I may not have answered your question.
No, I think you have given us a very good opinion on this, and so maybe, for example, Joughin and yourself would like to take this offline, although it may, of course, be my misinterpretation of all of this. And actually, Joughin's just saying through on chat right now, she says she agrees they are parts of a whole, so therefore they're different, but they're also part of the same organism, perhaps. So with that, Jane, thank you very, very much once again, and again, we are clapping wildly.